Everyone in town laughed when she said she'd ride the sheriff's wild horse. But no one was laughing 5 minutes later. They said the fire had cursed that horse forever, that no one could tame him, not after the sheriff died trying. But one morning, under a sky heavy with silence, a young blacksmith's daughter walked into the corral, small, trembling, and fearless. The crowd laughed, until the impossible happened. The Texas sun burned low across the horizon, turning the sky into molten copper. A hammer struck against an anvil, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat that refused to die. Each blow sent sparks scattering across the dusty floor of the old forge, where 15-year-old Clara Reeves stood, sleeves rolled to her elbows, soot streaked across her cheek. The forge had once belonged to her father, a man who died the night Westfield's sheriff went down with him in the flames. People in town never said it outright, but the whispers carried far enough. That girl's daddy killed Sheriff Cole. Clara heard it every time she walked past the grocery, every time she carried supplies from the hardware store. Some whispered, some stared, but all kept their distance. It didn't matter that she was just a child back then, that her father had run back into the burning stable trying to save the sheriff's horse. Rumors didn't care about truth. They lived longer than men ever could. Inside the forge, heat rolled off the furnace, filling the air with the smell of smoke and iron. Her grandmother, Martha Reeves, sat near the open door, shelling pecans in a tin bowl. Her hair was white as ashes, her voice soft, but unshakable. "You keep hitting that iron like it owes you something," she said without looking up. Clara didn't stop. "Maybe it does." Martha sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "That horse isn't your burden to carry, Clara." The girl paused, sweat dripping from her temple. "Then why do I hear him every night?" Beyond the forge walls stretched a field of brittle grass and mesquite trees. When the wind blew just right, the faint echo of a horse's cry drifted from the Cole Ranch 3 miles west. The voice of Ravenfire, the black stallion who had once been the pride of Sheriff Raymond Cole. Since the fire 5 years ago, the animal had turned feral, attacking anyone who came near. Folks said he'd gone mad the night his master died. But to Clara, that cry wasn't madness. It was grief. She took another swing with the hammer, sparks leaping like fireflies before dying in the dirt. "You think God lets horses remember?" she asked quietly. Martha stopped shelling. "I think God lets them forgive before people do." The words settled heavy between them. Outside, a pickup rumbled past on the main road, the sound fading into the stillness of the evening. From a distance came the clang of a church bell and the faint laughter of neighbors. Normal life, far away from this forge where a girl and her grandmother lived among ashes and memories. When the day finally dimmed, Clara quenched the glowing metal in a bucket of water. Steam rose like a ghost between them. She wiped her face, watching it vanish. "Tomorrow, I'll take the new shoes to the Johnson Ranch," she murmured. Martha nodded. "Be careful on the road. Luke Cole's men are laying out new survey lines near the highway." At the mention of his name, Clara's stomach tightened. Luke Cole, son of the late sheriff, now wore the badge his father once carried. In every town meeting, his voice carried authority, and people listened. He wasn't cruel, but he had his father's stubborn pride, and his father's shadow hanging over him. He'd never spoken to Clara since the night of the fire, never even looked her way. She wasn't sure which hurt more, the whispers from strangers or the silence from him. Night came in slow blue waves. Clara stepped out of the forge, letting the cool air wash over her. Crickets chirped under the stars, and somewhere out there, a lone coyote howled. She stared west, toward the Cole ranch. The horizon glowed faintly with lantern light, and then, clear and raw, the sound rose again. Ravenfire's cry, cutting through the dark like a broken prayer. It wasn't just a sound. It was a memory, the flash of orange flame, her father's hand pushing her toward the door, the sound of the horse screaming inside the smoke, the sheriff's voice shouting her name. Then nothing. She pressed her palm against her chest, as if to quiet her racing heart. In the stillness, Martha's voice floated from behind her. "Clara, come in. The night's turning cold." But Clara didn't move. She kept her eyes on the distant lights of the Cole ranch, where the horse cried again. Lower now. Tired. "I can't," she whispered to the wind. "Not yet." The hammer still sat on the anvil, cooling in the dark. Tomorrow it would strike again, the town would whisper again, and the horse would still be waiting. She didn't know it yet, but that waiting would soon change everything. The following morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of Texas dawn that smelled of dust and iron. Clara woke before sunrise, the forge still cold, her fingers stiff from sleep. She tied her hair back with a strip of leather and walked out into the yard. The fields stretched endless and gold, but her eyes went west, to where smoke rose faintly from the Cole ranch. She could almost feel the echo of that cry again, the one she'd heard last night, rolling low across the plains. By mid-morning, she was on her way to deliver the horseshoes she'd made, the wooden crate balanced in the back of the old pickup. The radio barely worked, static and an old country song fading in and out, but it was enough to keep her company on the empty road. Ads for farm insurance, auto loans, and home security systems flickered between stations, filling the silence with the hum of another world she didn't belong to. As she passed the outskirts of town, she saw the crowd gathered outside Cole auction yards. The large sign still bore the sheriff's family name in fading black paint. Trucks lined the dirt lot, men in boots and hats leaning against the rails, murmuring and spitting into the dust. The air carried the smell of hay, sweat, and anticipation. Clara slowed the truck, frowning. Then she heard the announcement through the loudspeaker, a voice she recognized immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Luke Cole, steady and commanding, "today we offer something truly unique. Sheriff Raymond Cole's own stallion, Ravenfire." Her breath caught. She turned off the engine, heart pounding as she slipped into the crowd. Heads turned as she passed. Some faces softened with pity, others with disdain. They all knew who she was. The blacksmith's girl, the daughter of the fire. Ravenfire stood in the middle of the corral, held by two men who looked like they'd rather face a storm than that horse. He was magnificent even in his fury, black coat glinting under the sun, mane tangled and wild, eyes like shards of obsidian. When he reared, the ground seemed to shake beneath him. Dust spiraled into the air, catching the light like gold smoke. Luke Cole stood by the fence, tall and clean-cut in his tan uniform. His badge caught the sunlight, a bright reminder of who ruled this town now. He watched the horse struggle with a look that was part grief, part cold calculation. "He's unpredictable," he told the crowd. "Too dangerous for work, too proud for the pasture. We'll start the bidding at 100. No one spoke. A few murmured about how the horse had thrown every trainer, even one from Houston who'd sworn he could handle anything with 4 legs. Someone said Ravenfire had killed a man once, though that was never proven. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. The sight of the animal, alive, angry, broken, was too much. It was as if she was staring at her father's unfinished apology. A man beside her laughed. "Maybe the girl who started the fire wants him," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "Make it poetic." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Luke turned his head sharply at the sound, his eyes landing on Clara. For the first time in years, he looked straight at her. His gaze didn't hold hatred. It held recognition, surprise, and something unreadable beneath it. Clara stepped forward before she even realized what she was doing. "Don't sell him," she said. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "He's not a beast. He's grieving." The laughter grew louder. Someone muttered, "She's lost her damn mind." Another voice added, "Tell that to the man he trampled." Luke's expression hardened. "Miss Reeves," he said evenly, "you have no place here." "I have as much right as anyone who remembers what that horse stood for," she replied. "He wasn't dangerous until people stopped listening." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He started to say something, but she spoke first. "Let me ride him." The laughter this time came like thunder. Even the handlers turned to stare at her as if she'd spoken in tongues. Luke blinked, his composure cracking. "You can't be serious." "I am." Her eyes didn't waver. "Your father trained him to trust people who showed courage, not fear. If I can ride him, you stop the sale." For a moment, the only sound was the restless snort of raven fire and the creak of leather straps. Then someone whistled mockingly. "That little thing? She won't last 2 seconds." Luke gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think this is about courage? That horse doesn't care about bravery. He doesn't even care about mercy anymore." "Then let him prove it." The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. The sun burned overhead. The dust clung to every breath. Luke looked down at her, at the sweat and soot on her face, the tremor in her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and for the briefest second, he saw something familiar. His father used to look that way before a storm, stubborn and full of faith in things the world had already given up on. He exhaled slowly. "You get one chance," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning. Sunrise. If you're still standing after that, we'll talk." The crowd murmured again, half in disbelief, half in anticipation of a show. The auctioneer shut his book. Bets were already being whispered. "The girl won't last 10 seconds. The horse will kill her. She's doing it for attention." Clara didn't hear any of it. She turned away from the ring, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. Behind her, Ravenfire screamed, a deep, raw sound that sent chills through her spine. As she reached the truck, Martha's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "God lets horses forgive before people do." She looked back once more at the black stallion, rearing under the blazing sky, his hooves slamming against the earth like thunder. The crowd scattered in awe and fear. Tomorrow, she thought. This ends. One way or another. And when she climbed into the truck and started the engine, she didn't notice Luke still watching her from the fence, the wind catching his hat as he whispered to himself, "You're just like him, aren't you?" The sound of the horse's cry followed her all the way home. The morning after the auction was gray and windless, the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath. Westfield's Main Street was still quiet when Luke Cole walked out of the sheriff's office, a paper cup of coffee steaming in his hand. His reflection flickered across the dusty window of the general store. badge gleaming, tie crooked, eyes rimmed with fatigue. The town trusted him. They always had. To them, Luke Cole was his father reborn, the man who'd kept Westfield safe for 20 years. But what they didn't see was the crack running right down the middle of that badge, invisible but deep, carved by guilt he could never name aloud. He'd been 29 the night the fire took his father. He remembered the smell first. Sweet hay burning, horses screaming. He'd arrived too late to pull the sheriff out, but early enough to see the blacksmith's workshop in flames. He'd seen the little girl crying outside, the one they said had dropped a lantern. She'd looked at him through the smoke, eyes wide and terrified, and before he could ask a single question, the building collapsed. Since then, every time he'd looked at Ravenfire, all he could see was that girl's face framed by firelight. Now she'd stood in front of him again, older, defiant, saying she could ride the horse that no man dared touch. Luke didn't know whether to admire her or fear what that defiance would cost. He climbed into his truck, the radio murmuring a low stream of ads, life insurance, mortgage refinancing, the promise of new beginnings that felt as hollow as the empty highway. The coffee went cold in his hand before he realized he'd driven to the ranch. The stables rose ahead, their wood dark with age and smoke stains that never quite faded. Inside, Ravenfire shifted restlessly, metal shoes striking the floor with dull thuds. The stable hands gave Luke wary looks. None of them liked being near the animal after yesterday's outburst. Luke dismissed them for the day and stood alone in the corridor, facing the stall. The horse turned his head, nostrils flaring. There was intelligence in that gaze, old and wounded. Luke took a step closer, speaking low. "You remember me, don't you?" The horse snorted, ears flattening. "Yeah," Luke muttered. "Me too." He reached toward the latch, hesitated, then drew his hand back. The memory hit like heat. His father's body pulled from the wreckage, soot streaked across the badge, the same stallion rearing against the smoke. He had never touched Ravenfire since that night. Never wanted to. Outside, the sound of gravel crunching drew his attention. Through the slats, he saw the blacksmith's truck pull up and the girl climb out. Clara Reeves. No hat, no fear, carrying nothing but a worn halter looped over her shoulder. Luke walked out to meet her. "You're early," he said. "You said sunrise," she replied, glancing toward the horizon where the first streak of light touched the fields. "I don't like being late." He studied her. The soot on her face from yesterday was gone, but not the determination in her eyes. "You understand what you're asking for?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." He almost smiled at the "sir." It sounded old-fashioned coming from her, respectful in a world that no longer used the word. "You get 10 minutes, he said. "No heroics. If he so much as twitches wrong, you step back. I'm not losing another person to that animal." Clara met his gaze evenly. He's not the one who's lost. Her words landed sharper than he expected. For a moment, Luke wanted to snap back, to remind her who had buried a father that night. But something about her face stopped him. She wasn't challenging him. She was stating a truth neither of them had dared face. They walked together toward the stables, silence stretched thin between them. The air smelled of dust and horse sweat. Inside, Ravenfire pawed the straw, muscles rippling beneath his coat like storm clouds. Clara paused at the gate, whispering under her breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. Luke leaned on the fence, arms crossed. "You think he'll remember kindness?" he asked. "I think he remembers everything," she said softly. The horse lifted his head, ears flicking toward her voice. It wasn't a miracle, not yet, but the sudden stillness was enough to make Luke hold his breath. Clara didn't move closer. She simply stood there, letting the animal look at her. Minutes passed. The world outside went quiet, except for the slow creak of wood. Luke watched her hands, steady as stone. His chest ached with something he couldn't name. Admiration, maybe envy. She wasn't fighting the horse. She was listening. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. She turned, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "Because I owe him," she said. "And because maybe I owe you too." He opened his mouth to reply, but Ravenfire stamped once, loud and sharp. Clara turned back instantly, whispering again, her body still as if she were part of the earth. The horse blew out a heavy breath and stepped back, tension fading for just a heartbeat before it came roaring back. "That's enough," Luke said, moving forward, but she lifted a hand to stop him. "He's testing me," she murmured. "So let him." It wasn't courage he saw then. It was faith, reckless and pure. Something his father used to carry like a lantern in the dark. Luke swallowed hard and backed away. When she finally stepped out, face pale but unshaken, he nodded once. "Tomorrow. Sunrise. The corral. If you still want to try, I'll hold the gate." She gave a faint smile. "Thank you, Sheriff." He watched her climb into the truck, the engine sputtering to life. The taillights disappeared into the pale morning fog, and he realized his hands were shaking. Ravenfire neighed behind him, a long, low sound that felt almost like a sigh. Luke looked toward the open fields, the same land his father had sworn to protect. "You always did trust the wrong people," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the horse or himself. Back inside the stall, Ravenfire turned his head again toward the road Clara had taken, ears pricked, listening. For the first time in 5 years, Luke thought he saw peace flicker in that animal's eyes. Brief, uncertain, like a candle in the wind. He stood there until the sun rose fully, painting the stables in gold. By the time the first light crawled across the horizon, Westfield was already awake. The word had spread overnight. There was going to be a show at sunrise. A girl, the blacksmith's daughter, was going to try to ride the sheriff's cursed horse. It sounded absurd enough to drag people from their porches and pickup trucks. Coffee cups steamed in rough hands, boots scuffed the dirt, and laughter rippled through the cold dawn air. Clara stood behind the stable, her palms slick with sweat despite the chill. She'd tied her hair back, her worn denim jacket buttoned to her throat. Every sound, the rustle of hay, the murmur of voices beyond the gate, echoed in her chest like thunder. Her grandmother's voice, low and steady, filled her memory. "Don't fight the world, child. Let it see who you are." Luke Cole was already there, standing by the corral fence. His badge glinted in the gray light, his hat pulled low. He looked at her the way one might look at a storm forming, equal parts awe and disbelief. Around him, half the town leaned on the rails, whispering, waiting. A few men passed folded bills between them, placing quiet bets. When Clara stepped into view, the laughter came immediately. Harmless at first, then louder. "She can barely reach the saddle," someone called out. "That horse'll kill her before she even blinks." Luke shot the man a sharp look, but he didn't tell them to stop. Maybe he thought the ridicule would scare her off. Maybe part of him hoped it would. Clara didn't flinch. She just looked at Ravenfire. The stallion stood near the far end of the corral, black coat gleaming with sweat even before the sun had fully risen. His breath fogged in the cold, each exhale a burst of white against the morning haze. The stable hands had reinforced the fencing overnight. Heavy planks, thick ropes. But still, no one wanted to be the one to let him loose. Luke climbed the fence beside the gate. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. He nodded once, then turned to the crowd. "You all stay behind the line. Nobody moves closer. If she gets hurt, it's on me." The murmurs quieted, replaced by the hum of cameras from a few locals who'd brought their phones. The idea of a girl riding the devil horse had gone from gossip to spectacle. Even the local paper's reporter had shown up, notebook ready. Clara stepped closer to the corral. The dirt was cold under her boots. She stopped a few feet from the gate, feeling every eye on her. Ravenfire's ears twitched, catching her movement. His muscles rippled under his coat, eyes burning with a wild, unbroken fury. "Hey there," she whispered. Her breath made a small cloud in the air. "I'm not here to fight you." A low rumble came from the stallion's chest. He tossed his head, pawing the ground. The sound made the crowd murmur nervously. "Open it," she said. Luke hesitated. "If he comes at you, then he comes," she said, and looked at him. "You promised." Something in her gaze disarmed him. Without another word, he lifted the latch. The gate creaked open. The world seemed to hold still. Ravenfire didn't charge. He froze, ears pinned, eyes locked on her. Clara could hear his breathing, fast and deep, like the wind trapped in a canyon. Slowly, she stepped forward. 1, 2, 3 paces, until she stood in the open. No barrier between them. The onlookers went silent. Even the horses in nearby stalls grew still. "I know you," she said softly. "You remember the fire. You remember him. I do too." Her voice shook, not with fear, but with something heavier. "He tried to save you, didn't he? My father. You saw him go back into the flames. You saw him fall." Ravenfire stamped once, his breath harsh. Clara's throat tightened. "They all think he caused it, that he lit the fire. But he didn't. He tried to stop it. He tried to save both of you." Her hand lifted slightly, palm open, as if offering the words to the air between them. "And I think maybe you're the only one left who knows the truth." Luke shifted uneasily, his knuckles white against the fence rail. The stallion took a step forward, nostrils flaring. The crowd gasped. Clara didn't move. She stood her ground, the hem of her jacket stirring in the wind. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can come closer." Another step. The distance between them closed like the breath between 2 heartbeats. When Ravenfire stopped, his head loomed above her, massive and powerful. She could see her reflection in his dark eyes, small, trembling, but there. Then, to everyone's shock, the horse lowered his head, just slightly, just enough. A sound rose from the crowd, a mix of disbelief and wonder, but no laughter this time. Luke exhaled. "I'll be damned," he murmured. Clara reached out, fingers brushing the air just shy of Ravenfire's muzzle. The stallion's skin quivered beneath a layer of dust and sweat. She didn't force the contact, didn't push. She simply waited. And then, slowly, he closed the space himself, pressing his nose against her hand. The touch was brief, but electric. The tension in the air snapped like a taut string finally breaking. Someone whispered, "Holy hell." Luke climbed down from the fence, moving closer, cautious. "Clara," he said quietly, "that's enough. You proved your point." She didn't look away from the horse. "No," she said, "not yet." For a moment, Luke saw what the crowd saw, just a girl and a horse, standing in the sunrise. But to him, it was more. It was memory and forgiveness stitched into one fragile instant. His father's shadow lingered there, in the shape of the animal's bowed neck, in the firelight of the girl's eyes. When Ravenfire finally stepped back, shaking his mane, the sound of his snort broke the spell. Clara dropped her hand, her whole body trembling. The applause that followed was hesitant, uncertain. No one quite seemed sure what they'd just witnessed. Luke walked toward her, voice low. "We'll stop here," he said. "You've done enough for one morning." Clara looked up, dirt streaking her face, eyes shining with something between exhaustion and relief. "No," she whispered again. "Tomorrow I ride him." The crowd erupted once more, disbelief turning back to noise, but it didn't reach her. Luke looked at her, wanting to argue, to protect, to understand. But she was already walking away, shoulders straight, leaving footprints in the dirt. The laughter started again as she passed the fence. Soft at first, then louder, chasing her to the edge of the field. Luke watched her go, jaw tight. He turned to the men, still leaning on the rails, and said in a voice that silenced them all, "You'll want to be quiet tomorrow." Behind him, Ravenfire threw his head and let out a long, echoing cry. The sound rolled across the dawn like a warning, or maybe a promise. Night fell slow over Westfield, pressing its quiet hands on everything. The forge, the fields, the stables miles away. In Clara's yard, the wind moved through the mesquite trees, carrying the faint sound of laughter still echoing from that morning. She had heard it all day in her head. The disbelief, the mockery, the quick burst of silence when Ravenfire bowed his head to her hand. Every face in that crowd had seen it, yet by sundown, most would convince themselves it hadn't happened at all. Inside the forge, the fire was small, a single flame flickering like a heartbeat. Clara sat before it, with her knees drawn up, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The smell of metal and smoke filled the air, the same scent that had clung to her father's clothes when she was little. Her grandmother sat nearby in her rocking chair, the rhythmic creak of wood filling the silence. "You did something today, Clara," Martha said finally, her voice low and steady. "People won't admit it yet, but they saw what they needed to see." Clara looked into the fire. "All they saw was a stupid girl and a dangerous horse. They're laughing again, just like before." Martha leaned forward, her eyes catching the glow. "Laughter's just fear wearing a friendly mask. You scared them, child. You reminded them what real courage looks like." The words lingered, but Clara didn't answer. She stared into the flame until her vision blurred. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and bruised pride, something had shifted. The horse had looked at her, not with rage, not with madness, but with recognition. After a long silence, she rose and went to the workbench. Her father's tools hung neatly on the wall, each one cleaned and oiled even after years of disuse. She ran her fingers over the handle of his hammer, tracing the worn grooves where his hand had been. "I'm scared, Grandma," she whispered. "If I fall tomorrow, if I can't do it, then you'll fall." "Honest?" Martha said, cutting in gently. "There's no shame in that." She stood, moving slower than she used to, and placed a folded piece of cloth in Clara's hand. "Your father made this for Sheriff Cole the year before the fire. Said the man rode like he carried lightning in his veins." Clara unfolded the cloth to reveal a small iron medallion, shaped like a horseshoe, engraved with a single word: Faith. She turned it over, thumb brushing the edge. "He never got to give it to him." "No," Martha said softly, "but maybe it's time someone did." The forge crackled, a burst of orange reflecting in Clara's eyes. She set the medallion on the table, next to the half-finished set of horseshoes she'd been shaping for Ravenfire. One of them gleamed faintly, its curve smooth and perfect, the mark of a craftsman's patience. "Tomorrow I'll finish them," she said, "and then I'll ride him." Outside, a gust of wind whistled through the trees, carrying the smell of rain. At the same hour, Luke Cole sat alone in his office downtown. The lamp on his desk flickered, its light spilling over stacks of reports and the framed photograph of his father on the wall. In the picture, the old sheriff smiled beside a horse with a coat black as midnight and a mane like smoke. Luke stared at it for a long time, remembering how small he'd felt standing next to both of them. He reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out a cigar box. Inside, under old notes and faded patches, lay a tarnished silver lighter, the same one they'd found near his father's body after the fire. He thumbed it open, striking the flint until a small flame appeared. It burned unsteady, trembling like the breath of a memory. His voice broke the silence. "I don't know what you saw in that man, Dad, or in his little girl, but she's not afraid of the things I am." He closed the lighter, plunging the room back into shadow. Through the window he could see the glow of the forge from miles away. The town might still be laughing, but he wasn't sure anymore. He'd seen the way Ravenfire looked at Clara, the way the wildness in the stallion's eyes had softened for a heartbeat. Something about that moment haunted him more than the fire ever had. By midnight, the rain began. It came soft at first, whispering against the roof, then stronger, drumming steady. Clara worked under the forge's shelter, sparks flying each time her hammer met the glowing iron. Sweat mixed with raindrops running down her neck. Each strike was an act of will, every motion a prayer. When the last shoe was done, she quenched it in water. The hiss echoed like a sigh. She lifted it carefully, setting it beside the medallion. Her grandmother watched from the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "You're ready," Martha said. Clara didn't look up. "I hope he is too." The clock on the wall ticked past 1. Clara sat down beside the forge, too tired to move, the firelight dancing across her face. The rain had eased outside, replaced by the low roll of thunder far in the distance. She closed her eyes for a moment, but sleep didn't come easy. In the space between dreams and waking, she saw the horse again, standing in the burning stable, the air thick with smoke. Her father's voice shouted her name, and Ravenfire screamed. "Run!" the memory said, and then everything turned white. She jerked awake, heart racing, the smell of smoke still sharp in her nose though the fire had long gone out. The medallion lay on the table, catching a sliver of light from the dying embers. Clara reached for it and held it tight in her hand. "Tomorrow," she murmured, her voice trembling but sure. No more running. By dawn, the forge had gone cold, the rain had stopped, and the wind carried only silence. At the ranch, Luke Cole stood by the corral, watching the gray clouds break apart above the hills. The stables were quiet, except for the occasional stomp of hooves. Ravenfire shifted restlessly in his stall, ears twitching toward the direction of the road, as if he already knew who was coming. Luke checked his watch. She'd be here soon. He didn't know if it was fear or hope tightening in his chest, but for the first time since the fire, he whispered something that felt like a prayer. Let the girl live. The next morning came slow and heavy, wrapped in the damp breath of retreating rain. A thin mist still clung to the fields outside Westfield, turning the world silver and quiet. Clara Reeves drove through it in her father's old truck, the engine coughing like an aging hound. Her grandmother's shawl lay folded beside her, the iron medallion resting in her palm. The word faith caught the pale light, trembling with every bump of the dirt road. Ahead, the coal ranch appeared like something carved from the fog. Fences, stables, a cluster of men waiting in silence. The air felt thicker than before, charged with something no one wanted to name. She could already see Ravenfire pacing behind the corral gate, his black coat slick with dew, his breath visible in the cold. Clara parked the truck and stepped out. Every sound seemed louder, the creak of her boots, the whisper of wind, even the beating of her heart. Luke Cole stood by the fence, arms crossed, a thermos in one hand. His uniform looked rumpled, as though he hadn't slept either. You came, he said quietly. I said I would. He studied her face, saw the dark circles under her eyes, the bruised half-smile that was somehow braver than any armor. You don't have to do this. I know, she said. That's why I will. Luke exhaled, long and slow, then nodded toward the gate. I tightened the latch. He's restless today. He knows something's coming. The crowd was smaller than yesterday, but still large enough to make her skin prickle. Ranchers, neighbors, a few curious kids perched on the rails. No one laughed this time. The air didn't allow it. Clara pulled on her gloves, flexed her fingers. The new horseshoes she'd forged gleamed faintly where they hung on the fence, perfect arcs of iron waiting to be claimed. She glanced once at Luke. If I fall, you won't, he said. It wasn't comfort. It was command. She smiled faintly. You sound like your father. That made him blink. For the first time, his voice softened. I wish I didn't. The corral stood silent except for the sound of Ravenfire's hooves against the dirt. The stallion's head lifted when Clara entered, ears pricking forward. She walked slowly, each step measured, her voice low and steady. Morning, old boy, she said. You ready? The horse pawed the ground, eyes fixed on her. She could feel his heartbeat in the air between them. Wild, uneven, alive. She took the medallion from her pocket and held it up. Your master never got this. Maybe it's time you did. She placed it gently on the fence post, right beside the gate. Then she reached for the latch. The moment the gate creaked open, Ravenfire snorted and stamped, muscles quivering. Clara didn't move closer yet. She waited, giving him the choice. A breeze moved through the corral, carrying the scent of wet hay and iron. Do you trust me? She whispered. The stallion's head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder muffled under clouds, he stepped forward. Clara's throat tightened. She lifted her hand slowly, offering her palm. The horse's muzzle brushed her fingers once, twice, before pulling back. His eyes were clearer now, Less fire, more storm light. She took that as permission. The first touch of her hand on his neck sent a ripple through him, half fear, half recognition. The crowd drew in a collective breath. Luke gripped the rail, every muscle tight. "Easy," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know what it's like to be angry at ghosts." Ravenfire's ears flicked back, then forward again. His breathing steadied. She moved along his side, her fingertips grazing the damp curve of his shoulder. Then she reached for the worn leather halter hanging by the fence. "Don't," Luke warned softly. But she didn't stop. When she slid the halter over the stallion's head, Ravenfire flinched, but didn't fight. The strap settled, the buckle clicked, and the sound broke something in the air. It was the sound of surrender. Or maybe forgiveness. Clara leaned her forehead against his neck. His skin was warm, pulsing with life under the dark coat. "You did nothing wrong," she murmured. Neither did he. For a second, the world held its breath. Then Ravenfire lowered his head until his muzzle brushed her shoulder. No one moved. Even the crows perched on the fence seemed frozen. Luke stepped forward, voice hushed. "Clara, he's letting you." She turned her face toward him, eyes bright with tears. "Then I guess it's time." He knew what she meant before she said it. "Wait." But she was already swinging her leg over the stallion's back. No saddle, no reins, only balance and faith. Ravenfire stiffened, muscles rippling. The crowd gasped. Clara pressed her hands lightly against his mane, whispering into the wind, "It's all right. I'm here." The horse trembled once, then stood still. The mist around them glowed faintly as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the corral. For the first time since the fire, the animal didn't rear or scream. He simply breathed. Luke's voice caught in his throat. "He's remembering," he said, almost to himself. Clara leaned forward, whispering again, "Let's walk, Ravenfire." And the impossible happened. The stallion took one step, then another. Then he began to move, slow and steady, carrying the girl in silence around the corral. The ground was soft, the air trembling with disbelief. People began to cry, quiet, unexpected tears. Luke took off his hat and pressed it to his chest. When Ravenfire stopped in front of the gate, Clara slid down, her boots hitting the dirt softly. The horse lowered his head again, brushing his nose against her sleeve. She laughed once, a sound half joy, half release. "I guess we understand each other now," she said. The wind shifted, carrying away the last of the fog. Sunlight spilled over the hills, catching on the medallion where it hung on the fence post. It gleamed like a promise finally kept. Luke stepped closer, eyes still on the horse. "How did you—" "She just listened," Martha's voice interrupted. The old woman had come quietly, wrapped in her shawl, watching from the fence. "Something the rest of us forgot how to do." Luke turned to her, words caught somewhere between apology and awe. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say." "Then don't," Martha said gently. "Just let her finish what she started." Clara looked up at the sky, clouds drifting apart to reveal a strip of blue. "Tomorrow," she said, wiping her eyes. "Tomorrow we ride for real." Luke frowned. I mean out there," she said, nodding toward the open fields beyond the fence. "Not in a pen, not for a crowd, just him and me." Luke didn't argue. He couldn't. The people began to drift away quietly. No jeers, no laughter, only the sound of boots against gravel. Something sacred had unfolded, and no one dared disturb it. As the last truck drove off, Luke lingered by the fence. Ravenfire stood calm beside Clara, ears flicking in the breeze. Luke finally spoke, voice low. My father used to say, some horses were born with the soul of men. I never believed him until today. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe he wasn't just talking about the horse. When she left, Luke stayed behind, staring at the empty corral. The medallion still shimmered in the light. He reached out, touched the cold iron, and for the first time in years, whispered the words he'd forgotten how to say. Thank you. The dawn broke clean the next day, sharp and blue after the storm. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and a low fog lingered like a secret not yet ready to fade. The town of Westfield still hummed with talk from the morning before. They had all seen it, how the wild horse bowed his head to the blacksmith's daughter. Most dismissed it as luck, or a trick of timing. But a few, the ones who had stood close enough to feel the stillness that fell over the corral, knew it had been something more. At the Reeves Forge, Clara stood at the window, watching the horizon brighten. Her grandmother brewed coffee in the old enamel pot, humming an old hymn. The smell of roasted beans mixed with iron and ash. Neither spoke for a while. There were no words big enough to hold what had happened the day before. Finally, Martha said, "If you're set on riding him again, you'd best do it before folks start turning it into a carnival." Clara smiled faintly, tightening the leather gloves on her hands. "I'm not doing it for them." "I know," Martha said. "That's why he'll listen." Clara kissed her grandmother's cheek, grabbed the worn satchel with a small apple and the polished medallion inside, and walked out into the pale morning. The truck's engine sputtered to life, louder than the quiet deserved, and carried her down the empty road toward the ranch. When she arrived, Luke Cole was already there. He leaned against the fence, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the mist lift off the fields. His face looked different this morning, less hard, less sure of the walls he'd built. "I thought you might come," he said. "I said I would," Clara answered. "I didn't think you meant this soon." She smiled. "You don't heal by waiting." Luke's gaze followed the line of the corral to where Ravenfire stood grazing near the far end, his coat dark against the silver grass. "He's been calm all night," Luke said quietly. "Didn't kick the stall once." "Maybe he knew I was coming," she said. He looked at her, something half like amusement flickering behind his eyes. "Maybe he knew he had to behave in front of you." Clara stepped past him, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Ravenfire lifted his head at the sound of her footsteps. His ears pricked, nostrils flaring as she drew closer. The apple glowed red in her hand like a drop of sunrise. "Hey there," she murmured. "I kept my promise." The stallion snorted softly and walked toward her. No anger, no hesitation, just recognition. When his muzzle brushed her palm, she felt his warm breath against her skin, the trust of a creature that remembered pain but chose to forget it, if only for a moment. She slipped the halter over his neck, whispering as she worked. "We're going to try something new today, all right? Just the two of us. No eyes, no bets." Luke followed them out to the open field, keeping at a respectful distance. "You sure you don't want a saddle?" he asked. "No," she said. "He doesn't need one." She put her foot in the stirrupless loop of the halter strap and swung herself onto his back. The movement was fluid, practiced from a lifetime of riding half-wild horses, but it still stole her breath. The ground looked far away. Ravenfire tensed, muscles bunching beneath her legs. Clara leaned forward, speaking low into his ear. "It's okay. Just breathe with me." For a moment, nothing. Then slowly, the stallion exhaled, the air shuddering through him. His ears relaxed, his stride loosened. Clara straightened her back and looked ahead. Nothing but the open pasture, wet with dew and promise. Luke called out, "If you're going to run, at least let me open the gate first." She laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "Then open it, Sheriff." He did, stepping aside as the gate swung wide. The field beyond rolled out toward the horizon, a sea of pale green and gold. Clara nudged Ravenfire's sides lightly. The stallion hesitated, then moved. One step, then another, then a walk that turned to a trot. The rhythm of his hooves beat against the earth like a steady drum. The wind lifted her hair, the world rushing past in color and motion. She felt it then. The raw, wordless joy of movement, of being alive. The pain, the shame, the weight of the town's whispers, all of it fell away. She could feel the stallion's heart pounding under her knees, strong and wild, and for the first time in years, she felt no fear. Behind her, Luke stood with his hands on the fence, watching in silence. The rising sun caught his face, revealing something he hadn't shown anyone since his father's death. Awe. Clara guided Ravenfire into a wide circle, then slowed him with the lightest touch. The horse obeyed, stopping in a spray of dew. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his neck. "You did it," she whispered. "You're free now." Ravenfire turned his head slightly, brushing his nose against her arm. It was such a small gesture, but it undid her completely. She felt the tears rise before she could stop them. When she looked up again, Luke was walking toward her, boots sinking into the soft ground. "You realize half the town's going to think this is a miracle," he said. Clara smiled through her tears. "Maybe it is." He glanced at Ravenfire, who stood calm, steam rising from his coat in the morning chill. "He doesn't look like the devil's horse anymore." "Because he never was," Clara said. "He just needed someone to believe that." Luke nodded slowly. His eyes drifted toward the edge of the pasture, where the old burned stable still stood in ruins, a scar of black wood half buried by grass. "I was there that night," he said quietly. "Your father didn't start it. The lightning hit the barn first. I saw him run in after my dad. I've spent 5 years blaming the wrong man." Clara froze. The wind stopped. "I'm sorry," Luke said, his voice cracking. "For the things I said. For how the town treated you. For everything." She looked at him for a long moment, her throat too tight to speak. Then she nodded once. "Then let's both forgive him," she said. "Your father. Mine. The horse. Everyone." Luke smiled. Tired. Real. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said. "It's just right." They stood there, the sheriff and the blacksmith's daughter, side by side while the sun climbed higher. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and wildflowers. Ravenfire lowered his head and began to graze, unconcerned with the ghosts that had haunted them all. After a while, Luke asked, "What will you do now?" Clara looked at the open fields stretching to the horizon. "Keep riding," she said simply, "and keep listening." He nodded. "If you ever need help?" "I know," she said, smiling. "But I think we'll be okay." Luke looked at the horse, then at her, and something like peace settled across his face. "You're braver than anyone I've ever met," he said. Clara laughed softly. No, just stubborn enough not to stop trying. When she turned Ravenfire toward home, the sun caught the medallion hanging from his halter. The word faith flashed once, bright as a promise reborn. Luke watched until they disappeared over the hill. Then he looked up at the sky, the same endless Texas blue his father used to love, and whispered, maybe this town's got a second chance too. Back on the ridge, Ravenfire broke into a gallop, the wind tearing through Clara's hair, the sound of his hooves echoing like thunder. The world blurred around them, but she didn't care. For the first time, the fire that once took everything from her now felt like something holy, something that had forged them both. And as they rode across the open land, there was no past, no pain, only forgiveness moving like wind through the grass. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of worn copper, the kind of sky that comes only after a storm and before the next one. The people of Westfield went about their routines, but talk of what had happened spread like wind through wheat. At the diner, truckers whispered that the sheriff's demon horse had been tamed by the blacksmith's girl. At the post office, old women folded their letters slower, eyes bright with something like hope. And by sundown, even those who'd mocked Clara the loudest began to speak her name with respect. But Clara knew stories had a way of twisting themselves into fables. She didn't want this to become a miracle people told around coffee cups. It wasn't a miracle. It was forgiveness. Raw and human, and earned the hard way. That evening, she rode Ravenfire back to the coal ranch. The air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke, the road glistening in the dim light. Luke was out by the paddock, stacking hay bales with his sleeves, rolled up. When he saw her approaching, he wiped his hands and leaned against the fence. "I thought you'd had enough riding for one day," he said. Clara smiled. "Not yet." Ravenfire lowered his head, breathing slow and easy. The sight still amazed Luke. He'd spent 5 years avoiding that animal, 5 years haunted by its cry every night. Now the same horse stood quiet, content, like a storm finally run dry. Clara dismounted and walked closer, the sound of her boots soft on the wet ground. "You said the barn's still standing?" Luke nodded toward the field behind the ranch. "What's left of it? I couldn't bring myself to tear it down." "Let's go," she said. They walked together across the open field. The grass brushed against their boots, wet and shining under the fading light. The old barn came into view, a skeleton of charred beams and rusted tin leaning into the wind. The smell of ash still lingered faintly, like a ghost. Clara stopped at the threshold. Her breath hitched. For a moment, she was 10 again, watching fire swallow the world. She saw flashes, her father's hand shoving her out, his voice shouting through the smoke. Luke noticed the way her shoulders tightened. "You don't have to go in." "Yes," she said. "I do." Inside, the floor creaked under their steps. Moonlight poured through holes in the roof, laying stripes of silver across the burned boards. The air was heavy with silence. Clara knelt near the back wall where the fire had burned hottest. She touched the blackened wood, her fingers coming away gray. "This is where it started," Luke said quietly. Lightning struck the roof beam. The hay caught first. My father was inside trying to calm the horses. "My father ran in after him," she whispered. And neither came out. For a long moment they stood there, the ghosts of 2 men between them. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out the sheriff's old lighter. "This was his," he said. "I've kept it all this time, thinking it meant something I didn't want to face." He thumbed it open. The flame flared small and steady. He used to say, light only matters when it finds darkness to shine in. Clara watched the flame dance. Then maybe it's time to let it find him again. Luke hesitated, then handed her the lighter. She crouched down, gathering a handful of dry straw and a few scraps of old wood. When the fire caught, it crackled softly, casting warm light on their faces. The smell of burning dust filled the air. It wasn't destruction this time. It was remembrance. She took the iron medallion from her pocket, the word faith glinting in the flicker. For a second she turned it over in her hand, then set it in the small fire. The metal hissed, glowing red. "What are you doing?" Luke asked. "Finishing what they started," she said. "They both gave everything trying to save what they loved. Maybe now they can rest." They stood together as the medallion cooled, the letters barely visible beneath the ash. The light flickered across Luke's face, softening the lines time had carved there. "You know," he said quietly, "he would have liked you. My dad. You remind me of the kind of people he trusted without needing to know why." Clara smiled faintly. Maybe he already does. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling the ashes into the air. They rose, glowing faintly in the moonlight, before vanishing into the night. The smell of smoke drifted away, replaced by the clean scent of rain-soaked earth. Luke closed the lighter, pocketing it again. What now? Clara looked at the barn, at the ground blackened and reborn with small shoots of green poking through. "We rebuild," she said simply. Luke tilted his head, studying her. "You mean this place?" "I mean all of it," she said. "The town, the trust, the stories people tell." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll start tomorrow." Ravenfire nickered softly from outside, impatient. Clara turned toward the sound, smiling. "He hates waiting." "Can't say I blame him," Luke said, chuckling. They stepped out of the barn, the fire behind them dying to embers. The horse stood at the edge of the field, the moonlight sliding across his dark coat. Clara placed her hand on his muzzle. "It's over," she said softly. "We can leave it here." Ravenfire's breath misted in the cool air. For a heartbeat, everything felt still. The wind, the night, the ghosts. Then the horse lifted his head and whinnied, a sound so clear and full that it echoed across the valley. Luke looked up at the sky, the stars bright above the storm clouds. "Feels like they heard him," he said. Clara nodded. Maybe they finally did. They walked back toward the ranch in silence. Behind them, the last wisp of smoke from the old barn curled into the night, carrying with it the ashes of 2 men and the burdens of 2 children who had finally learned how to let go. By the time they reached the fence, the eastern horizon was paling again. The promise of another dawn. Luke paused, hand resting on the wood rail. "You ever think about what comes after forgiveness?" Clara thought for a moment, looking at Ravenfire grazing in the field. "You live," she said. "And you make sure it's worth what it cost." He smiled. "Then I guess we'd better get to it." The first light touched the medallion lying buried beneath the ash. It glowed faintly, as if the earth itself remembered. And for the first time in Westfield's long, quiet history, the past didn't feel like something that needed to be feared. It felt like something that had finally found peace. Summer came late that year, sliding quietly into Westfield without fanfare. The grass grew thick again where the old barn had burned, and the scent of rain turned sweet instead of bitter. People began to speak differently when they talked about the Reeves girl and the sheriffs, hoarse, less like a story of danger, more like a lesson. They said it softly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. At the forge, the air shimmered with heat. Clara wiped sweat from her brow and examined the horseshoe she'd just finished. The hammer blows rang true again, steady and sure. She'd repaired the cracks in the roof herself, patched the walls with boards Luke had brought from the ranch. It wasn't a new building, but it no longer felt haunted. Martha sat on a stool near the doorway, sewing a leather bridle. "He came by this morning," she said casually. Clara didn't look up. "Luke?" Her grandmother nodded. "Left this for you." She handed over a folded envelope, smudged with dirt. Inside was a simple note written in neat, slanted handwriting. "Thought you might want to see what Faith built. Come by the ranch." Below the words was a rough map, drawn by hand. Clara smiled, folded the note, and tucked it into her pocket. "Guess I'll have to see what he means." The road to the coal ranch shimmered in the noonday light. Ravenfire moved easily beneath her, his stride smooth and confident. Every hoofbeat on the packed dirt sounded like a heartbeat, steady and alive. She still marveled at how calm he'd become. When the wind picked up, his mane whipped across her hands, the same black fire that once terrified half the county, now nothing more than freedom in motion. As they crested the hill overlooking the property, Clara saw the changes instantly. Where the burned barn had stood, a new structure rose, sturdy white fences surrounding a broad ring of earth, its gate marked by a wooden sign carved with careful letters. The Westfield Riding and Healing Center. Children ran across the paddock, laughter rising above the sound of hooves. A few adults, veterans, Clara guessed by the way they moved, walked slowly beside patient horses, hands resting against their warm flanks. The air buzzed with life, hope, and the low hum of purpose. Luke was by the gate, sleeves rolled up, showing someone how to hold the reins properly. He turned when he heard her approach, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You made it." Clara dismounted, patting Ravenfire's neck. "You built this?" "Not alone," Luke said, smiling faintly. "Turns out a few of those folks who used to bet against you had money to spare, and a conscience to clean. We call it a community project now." Clara looked around, eyes shining. "It's beautiful." He shrugged. "Still needs work, but it's a start. Thought if a horse could find his way back from hell, maybe people could too." Ravenfire flicked his ears and nudged Luke's shoulder, making him chuckle. "He's still your horse," Luke said, "but he seems to think he's in charge of both of us." Clara grinned. "That sounds about right." They walked the perimeter together. Every few yards, someone waved. Neighbors, strangers, even the reporter from the local paper who'd once written about the girl who rode the devil's horse. She was helping paint the fence now, sleeves streaked with white. "It feels different here," Clara said quietly. "Lighter." Luke nodded. "We've been calling it a second chance place. People bring horses that can't be ridden, kids who don't talk anymore, soldiers who wake up screaming. We don't fix them. We just listen." She smiled. "That sounds familiar." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "You taught me that." They reached the far corner of the paddock, where a small wooden plaque hung under the shade of a tree. 2 names were carved side by side, Raymond Cole and Samuel Reeves. Beneath them, a single line read, "They tried to save what they loved." Clara touched the wood gently, tracing the letters with her fingertip. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," Luke said. "For both of them. For us." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the breeze rustling through the tall grass. Ravenfire grazed nearby, calm and content. Then, from across the field, a boy called out, "Sheriff, she won't move." He was standing beside a chestnut mare, gripping the reins awkwardly. Luke smiled at Clara. "Your turn." She walked toward the boy, motioning him to step back. "She's scared," she said gently, stroking the mare's neck. "When a horse freezes like this, it's not defiance, it's fear. You've got to give her something better to believe in." The boy frowned. "Like what?" "Like you," Clara said. She took his hands, guided them to the mare's shoulder. "Feel that? That's her heartbeat. Match it with yours." He did, breathing slowly, and after a moment the horse's tension eased. The mare lowered her head, nudging his arm. The boy's eyes widened in wonder. She listened. Clara smiled. They always do if you whisper kindly enough. When she turned back, Luke was watching from the fence, that half-smile returning. "You know," he said, "you could do this full-time. Train, teach, whatever you want. There's space here for you." Clara looked around at the wide pastures, the sound of laughter and hooves, the weightless air. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from the past. She was standing right in the middle of what it had given her. "I think," she said, "I already do." Luke nodded, his eyes soft. "Then I'll call it official." Ravenfire lifted his head, snorting as if in approval. The mare in the ring whinnied back, and for a brief second, it felt as though every sound on that land carried the same heartbeat. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, Clara stood by the fence, watching the children ride in the fading light. The laughter drifted across the field, mingling with the rustle of wind in the grass. It struck her then. How easily pain could turn into beauty when people chose to build instead of bury. Luke joined her, leaning on the rail. "You think they'll remember this?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, then at the horizon painted gold and red. "Maybe not every detail," she said, "but they'll remember how it felt, to believe something broken could heal." He nodded. "That's enough." The last rays of sunlight caught on the metal sign above the gate. The letters shimmered, almost alive. Faith, the same word her father had forged, reborn in a place where it finally belonged. Clara reached for Ravenfire's mane, her hand steady, her smile soft. "We did it, old boy," she whispered. "We gave them their second chance." The horse turned his head toward her, eyes calm, unafraid. And in the quiet that followed, with the world turning slowly into night, it felt as though Westfield itself exhaled. A town once broken, now breathing easy again. Autumn returned to Westfield with a softer kind of light. The long days of heat had faded into gold, and the fields stretched wide under a sky that looked tired but kind. The wind that once carried dust now brought the smell of hay and apples from the nearby orchards. Seasons had turned, quietly and without ceremony, as if the town itself had learned how to breathe again. At the forge, Clara Reeves worked slower these days, not from weariness, but from peace. The ringing of her hammer no longer sounded like defiance. It sounded like rhythm, a pulse that kept the world steady. On the wall above the workbench hung a photograph Luke had given her. The grand opening of the Riding and Healing Center, kids waving from horseback, veterans smiling in the background, Ravenfire standing calm and proud behind them. Underneath, a small plaque read, "Dedicated to those who believed twice." Martha sat by the window, knitting something in soft blue yarn. "He sent another letter," she said without looking up. Clara set down the tongs and wiped her hands. "Luke? Who else?" The older woman smiled. "He says the center's taking in more horses every week. They're calling one of the new barns the Reeves Wing." Clara blinked, surprised. "He didn't tell me that." "Maybe he wanted it to be a quiet gift," Martha said. "Not all kindness needs an audience." Outside, the late afternoon sun poured through the dusty window, turning everything inside the forge amber. Ravenfire waited near the fence, his mane catching the light, his eyes half closed in contentment. The scars along his neck had faded to a silvery trace, like the memory of pain that no longer hurt. Clara walked out and leaned against the fence beside him. "You still miss him, don't you?" she murmured. The horse flicked an ear, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder. "I know," she whispered. "I do too." The sound of an approaching truck broke the quiet. Luke stepped out when it stopped, carrying a wooden crate under his arm. He looked older somehow, or maybe just more human. Sun lines at the corners of his eyes, a weariness softened by purpose. "Thought I'd drop by," he said. "You got a minute?" "For you?" "Always," Clara said, smiling. He set the crate on the fence rail. "Brought something back from town. Don't worry, it's not another plaque." She lifted the lid. Inside were tools, new tongs, a shaping hammer, and a small anvil polished smooth. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else. I've been offered a position down in Austin, training cadets. It's a good step, I think." She nodded, though her chest tightened a little. "You'll do good there." He studied her face, as if memorizing it. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Or maybe not goodbye. Just see you later." "Then say that," she said softly. He looked past her to the horse grazing by the fence. "Hard to believe that's the same creature who used to terrorize this whole ranch." "Hard to believe about any of us," Clara said. Luke smiled faintly. "You know, my father used to tell me that courage wasn't about the battles you win. It's about staying soft in a world that tries to harden you. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now." Clara reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a small object, a coin-sized disc of iron. On it, she had engraved a single word: "Listen." She pressed it into his hand. "You taught me how to stand my ground," she said. "I figured you could use something to remind you how to stay open." He looked down at it for a long time, thumb tracing the letters. "You know," he said quietly, "for a blacksmith, you make some dangerous magic." "Only if you believe in it," she said. They stood in silence for a while, the wind moving through the grass, the sound of the forge still echoing faintly from inside. Finally, Luke said, "You'll come down sometime, right? Maybe bring him?" "Maybe," she said. "If he wants to go." Ravenfire raised his head at the sound of her voice, tail swishing lazily. Luke reached out, letting the horse sniff his hand. For the first time, the animal didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, nudging Luke's palm gently. "That's new?" Luke said. "Not really," Clara answered. "He's been forgiving you for a while now. You just hadn't noticed." He laughed softly, the sound carrying in the wind. Then he turned toward the truck. "Take care of yourself, Clara." "You too, Sheriff." He paused, half smiling. "It's just Luke now." She watched him drive away, the dust rising behind the tires, fading into the orange haze of evening. When the road was empty again, she turned to Ravenfire. "Well," she said, "I guess it's just us again." The horse flicked his ears, as if answering. As the sun sank lower, Clara opened the gate and led him out toward the open field. The air shimmered gold around them. She mounted bareback, her hand resting on the curve of his neck. For a long moment, they stood still, breathing in sync, the same calm rhythm they had learned together. Then she whispered, "Run." Ravenfire surged forward, hooves pounding the earth. The wind tore through her hair, the world blurring into light and motion. They crossed the fields where once there had been fear and ash, now thick with new grass. The town lay small behind them, a collection of lights and memories. Ahead, the horizon stretched forever. When they slowed at last, she looked around. The endless sky, the whisper of the wind, the sound of his breathing steady beneath her. She felt her father there, and the sheriff, and every soul that had once been broken and now found peace in the same soil. She dismounted, standing beside Ravenfire as the last light slipped away. The world felt still, but not empty, full of quiet things that mattered. The wind moved through the tall grass, and she closed her eyes, listening. It sounded like forgiveness. It sounded like home. If this story touched something in you, tell me what part stayed with you the most. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And if you'd like to join me for more stories about courage, compassion, and second chances, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.